I still remember the way the morning sunlight hit the empty office, bouncing off the polished wooden desk my wife had spent years perfecting. It was silent, except for the occasional hum of the air conditioner, a hollow echo that seemed to mock the emptiness around me. When she had passed, the world didn't stop. The clock didn't care. But every second in that office reminded me of the void she left behind. I hadn't realized grief could feel so suffocating, that every breath could weigh so heavily on a man who once thought he was strong. I was wrong. I was fragile, exposed, and painfully human. I walked slowly across the floor, tracing my fingers over the surface of her chair, still warm from where she had sat last. Her favorite pen lay on the desk, its ink still flowing as if it waited for her hand to return. I picked it up and held it like a lifeline, imagining for a fleeting moment that she would walk through the door, smile at me, and tell me everything would be all right. But the emptiness answered only with silence, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch further, consuming the warmth from the room. The contractor had been working in her office for days, updating, repairing, and improving, he claimed. I had been too numb to care, too consumed by the hollow ache in my chest to pay attention. But that morning he arrived earlier than usual, his presence filling the space like an intruder. I hadn't noticed how quickly the small annoyances of life, voices, footsteps, even the sound of a tool scraping against wood, had started to pierce my grief like tiny daggers. And when he said it, that casual, cutting remark, it hit me like a punch I didn't see coming. "Don't come alone, bring your sons." The words echoed in my mind, sharp and alien, cutting through the fragile barrier I had built around my emotions. My sons, I didn't have any. The contractor's assumption, casual as it was, felt like a deliberate insult. As if my grief wasn't enough, as if the loss of my wife, the love of my life, needed to be compounded by the reminder that I had no one left to stand beside me. I felt the blood drain from my face. The weight of that loneliness settled deeper into my bones, and I realized then that pain isn't just the absence of someone you love. It's the presence of cruel reminders that life keeps moving, while you are stuck in the wreckage. I tried to keep my voice steady to mask the storm raging inside. I'm alone," I said, each word tasting bitter, heavy, unnatural in my mouth. The contractor shrugged, oblivious to the tremor of my voice, as if loneliness were just another fact of life, another thing men accept quietly without complaint. But to me, it was a blade twisting, and I could feel it gnawing at my insides. The memory of her laughter, the softness of her voice when she called me from across the room, pressed into my mind, and I realized just how fragile I had become in her absence. The office had once been a place of life and energy, a reflection of her spirit. Now it was a tomb. Every file she had touched, every note she had scribbled, every photograph of her smiling in some forgotten moment, it all reminded me that I was alone, and worse, that the world didn't care. I sank into her chair, letting the weight of grief crush me entirely, and for a moment I wondered if I would ever feel whole again. I felt my eyes sting, the sting of tears threatening to escape, yet I held them back, ashamed that anyone, even a man fixing a floorboard, could witness the depth of my brokenness. The contractor, busy with his hammer and nails, was oblivious to the tempest he had stirred. I watched him, noticing how his movements were precise, controlled, and untroubled by the human suffering he had so casually punctuated with a single sentence. The contrast between his ease and my devastation was unbearable. It felt like a cruel joke the universe was playing on me, highlighting my helplessness with every strike of his tool. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to tell him that grief isn't a passing inconvenience. It's a storm that consumes everything in its path. But I didn't. I couldn't. I sat there, silent, drowning in a quiet agony that was all mine. Hours passed. The contractor left eventually, leaving behind the faint smell of sawdust and paint, a reminder that life outside this office was moving forward, indifferent to my suffering. I stayed seated, tracing the grain of the desk with trembling fingers, trying to hold on to her presence through memory alone. Pain, I realized, wasn't just a feeling, it was a companion. It followed me, stayed with me and whispered endlessly about what I had lost. And yet in that same pain there was a strange clarity. A realization that this emptiness, as unbearable as it was, could not be ignored. It demanded recognition, demanded attention, and in its cruel, unrelenting way, it forced me to confront the fragility of my own existence. I didn't cry, not yet. The tears would come later in private when the world wasn't watching. For now, I let the pain settle into me, heavy, raw, and undeniable. Every sound, every shadow, every memory pressed in, reminding me that life had moved on without her, without me. And in that realization, something shifted, not hope, not yet, but the understanding that my story, my suffering, and my quiet endurance were only beginning. That day in that office, surrounded by the echoes of her absence and the careless intrusion of another man's words, I learned what it truly meant to be alone. Pain is not a momentary sting. It is a living, breathing entity, and it had claimed me fully. The following week, I returned to the office, determined to go through my late wife's files, to organize, to somehow make sense of the life she had built and left behind. I thought maybe, in order to survive this grief, I had to see her work, her achievements, her very essence scattered across folders and documents. But I hadn't expected that visiting her space could become another stage for the world to remind me of my helplessness. The contractor was there again, this time with two other men I hadn't met before. Their voices bounced off the walls, loud, brash, and careless, as if the office was theirs and I had stumbled into a theater of their amusement. They were laughing, pointing at various things, making jokes I didn't fully hear but felt the sting of immediately. One of them tapped on a framed photograph of my wife and me, leaning in with a sneer that said, without words, "Look at this pathetic man mourning someone he cannot protect." I flinched instinctively, gripping the edge of the desk as though it could anchor me to some dignity I had lost in that moment. And then the contractor, smirking like he was the only sane person in a room of fools, said it again, louder this time, as if daring the universe to notice my shame. "You really should have brought your sons, you know." His words weren't just insensitive, they were venomous. He wasn't acknowledging my grief. He was mocking it, twisting my loneliness into entertainment for his companions. I felt my face burn, my chest tighten, and a rage I hadn't realized existed flared in me. But there was nothing to do, nothing to fight back with. I was unarmed against their casual cruelty, and in that moment I understood what public humiliation truly meant, being stripped of dignity not by circumstance, but by the thoughtless, almost gleeful cruelty of others. I tried to focus on the papers before me, ignoring the sneers, the chuckles, the casual glances they shot my way, as if I were some character in a play written for their amusement. But it was impossible. Every file I touched felt contaminated by their laughter, every note a reminder that I was on display, exposed. The grief of my heart turned into spectacle. They poked at minor imperfections in the office's renovations, making exaggerated comments about paint, furniture, even the placement of a lamp. It wasn't the repairs that stung. It was the insinuation that I had failed, that in addition to losing her, I had somehow allowed her world to deteriorate under my watch. Then came the worst part. One of them, bold, brash, decided to make a game of it. He rummaged through her personal drawers, loud enough for me to hear every careless scrape, every clatter of papers hitting the floor. He found her diaries, her private notes, and read aloud in a mocking tone. I could see it in their eyes. They thought it hilarious to expose her thoughts, her fears, her dreams to strangers. My wife, who had entrusted me with the most intimate parts of her life, now had those pages weaponized against me, her words transformed into instruments of my public shame. I wanted to scream. I wanted to yell at them to leave, to respect her memory, to respect me. But the voice that rose in me was a fragile whisper, swallowed immediately by the enormity of the humiliation. I sat frozen, unable to defend her, unable to defend myself. The fire of indignation raging silently inside. They had stripped the sanctuary of her life, my refuge of mourning, and turned it into a stage for their amusement. The laughter, the mocking tones, the casual cruelty, They were etched into my memory, a permanent mark of this betrayal by life itself. And then, as if the cruelty wasn't complete, one of them, likely drunk on his own arrogance, mocked the fact that I had tried to maintain some semblance of order. He picked up a photograph of her awards, of her achievements, and dropped it carelessly onto the floor. The glass cracked. The sound was sharp, unforgiving. I felt it physically, like a blow to the chest. My hands shook, but I couldn't pick it up. I couldn't stop them. I realized in that unbearable instant that humiliation isn't just words or laughter. It's the destruction of what you hold sacred, done publicly, watched by eyes that judge you for not having the power to stop it. The contractor leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching me crumble in silence. "See, this is why you need sons. Someone to defend your honor, your space, your life," he said, his words laced with mockery, with the satisfaction of a predator marking its territory. He wasn't just speaking to me. He was speaking to anyone who might enter later, anyone who might witness the unraveling of a man undone by grief. And I realized that day that humiliation wasn't just a fleeting moment. It could be inflicted, layered, replayed over and over, a public spectacle I couldn't escape. I felt eyes on me, not just theirs, but the imagined judgment of the world outside. I could feel the whispers forming. The man who lost his wife, alone, powerless, undone. It wasn't just the office. It wasn't just the contractor. It was the realization that grief in public is not honored, not respected. It is mocked, trivialized, and turned into a story others tell with laughter while you sit there powerless, your dignity in pieces around your feet. I didn't cry again, not then. The tears had fled into the deeper recesses of my heart, replaced by a hollow, raw awareness of my exposure. I spent hours cleaning, straightening, attempting to reclaim some shred of her office, some piece of her life, but every effort seemed inadequate. Their voices echoed in my ears long after they had left, their laughter a shadow that followed me home. Even in the solitude of my own house, the public humiliation clung to me, a phantom of shame that refused to release its grip. That night I sat alone in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. I could feel the weight of their mockery pressing down on my chest. I realized something terrifying. Pain is bearable when it is private. But when it is observed, judged, dissected, it becomes unbearable. The contractor's words, their actions, the careless invasion of her memory, it had all transformed grief into a public performance, a cruel comedy at my expense. And in that moment, I understood that humiliation could be worse than death itself. Not the death of a body, but the death of dignity, the slow erosion of self in the eyes of others. I had nothing left to defend myself with. I was a man undone, stripped of pride, left alone with the echoes of laughter, the sneers, and the casual cruelty of strangers who had no idea the weight of what they were dismantling. My wife's office, once a place of warmth and life, was now a monument to my vulnerability, a place that reflected back my deepest failures, not of her loss, but of my inability to protect her, to maintain her world, to command respect from those who saw weakness and seized upon it. And yet, as I sat there, consumed by shame and public derision, a part of me began to notice something else. A quiet ember of awareness, a flicker of understanding that this pain, this humiliation would not define me forever. I could not change what they had done, could not erase the echo of their laughter. But I realized in that dark, oppressive night that humiliation is only complete when you accept it, only when you allow it to claim you entirely. And I knew, with the first clarity I had felt in weeks, that I would not accept it. Not quietly, not easily. That night the office and their mockery became etched into my memory, a deep scar of public humiliation that would fuel the days to come. The world had seen me broken, had laughed at my grief, had mocked my loneliness. But I vowed then, silently, that one day the balance would shift. One day the world would see that the man who had endured this exposure was not defeated, merely gathering strength in the shadows, waiting for the moment when silence and patience would become instruments of reckoning. After that day, I stopped visiting the office for a while. The walls, once a sanctuary of memory, had become a theater of shame. Every thought of returning carried with it the echo of their laughter, the sneer of the contractor, and the sharp sting of his words. "Bring your sons." I tried to escape into the quiet of my home, into the comfort of empty rooms filled only with memories, but silence has a way of being louder than any noise. In the absence of mockery, I could finally hear the full weight of my grief, the unspoken, the unbearable, the void my wife had left behind. Silence became my companion. At first, it felt like relief. The absence of others' judgment gave me room to breathe, to feel, to collapse without an audience. But slowly I realized that silence could be its own kind of torment. It amplified every fear, every regret, every thought I had pushed aside in the chaos of life. I could hear her voice in my mind, not the voice of today, but the voice of years past, reminding me of promises, of love, of warmth I would never hold again. It was a cruel echo, and yet it was the only thing that felt real. I spent hours sitting in her chair, staring at the desk, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, counting the seconds between each mechanical click. Each tick of the clock was a reminder that life continued outside these walls while I was trapped in a space that had once been hers. The silence around me wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum, drawing every ounce of energy from me. Every memory of laughter, of arguments, of the mundane rituals of life now returned with crystal clarity, each one a knife twisting deeper into the wound of loss. In that silence, I began to notice things I had never seen before. The smallest details she had loved, the curve of the lamp, the placement of books, the exact shade of paint on the walls, spoke to me in whispers only I could hear. They were her fingerprints on the world, her essence captured in every object, and in that realization I felt both closer to her and painfully aware of how absent she truly was. Silence gave me the space to grieve fully without interruption, but it also forced me to confront the unvarnished truth. I was alone. Completely, utterly alone. The loneliness was suffocating, yet there was a strange clarity that came with it. I began to reflect on the contractor's words, the public humiliation, and the mockery I had endured. In the absence of noise, I could finally analyze it, dissect it, and understand it in a way I couldn't when I was engulfed by their laughter. They had seen weakness and tried to exploit it. They had assumed my solitude meant helplessness. And perhaps for the first time, I realized that their perception of me could be manipulated, but it did not have to define me. Silence was teaching me patience, teaching me observation, and teaching me the power of restraint. I also began to notice the world outside the office. People walked past, oblivious to the devastation within those walls. Their indifference was a lesson of its own. Life doesn't pause for grief, for humiliation, for pain. Everyone continues on, and those who see your suffering rarely intervene. It was a bitter truth, one that sank deep into me, sharpening my mind even as it broke my heart. In the silence, I found focus, a quiet understanding that if I wanted to reclaim control, I could not rely on the kindness or decency of others. I would have to craft it myself. Even at home, silence wrapped itself around me like a second skin. I could hear the faint sounds of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the occasional bark of a dog, but they felt distant, muted, as if I were in a different world entirely. The absence of conversation forced me to confront thoughts I had avoided, fears about the future, regrets about the past, questions about my own worth. And in confronting them, I discovered a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. The grief that had once threatened to drown me was now a river I could navigate. If only I remained patient, if only I learned to move carefully through its currents. Silence also taught me observation. I watched the contractor's work from afar, noting the patterns, the habits, the arrogance in his posture, the confidence in his voice when speaking to others. I began to understand how easily people like him relied on assumptions and mockery to assert dominance, and how fragile that dominance was when challenged with careful thought and strategy. The quiet gave me insight. It gave me time to plan, to anticipate, to prepare. I realized that this silence, though heavy, was not emptiness. It was a tool, a period of incubation for something that had not yet taken form. I didn't speak to anyone about what had happened. Friends offered condolences, but there was no one who understood the specific humiliation I had endured, the subtle cruelty that lingered in every corner of her office. Talking would have been an admission, a declaration of vulnerability. And in that vulnerability, the contractor and his men had already found satisfaction. So I remained silent. I learned to move through the world quietly, observing, listening, noting every detail, every slight, every opportunity hidden in plain sight. The silence became armor, a protective shell that concealed my intentions while sharpening my resolve. In the quiet hours of the night, I reflected on the life my wife and I had shared. I remembered how she faced challenges with grace, how she met cruelty with quiet dignity. And I realized that in emulating her strength, in embracing this silence, I was honoring her memory in the only way left to me. The world had witnessed my pain, my humiliation, and my loneliness. Now, in silence, I would gather the tools to reclaim my narrative, to turn the weaknesses they had exposed into strengths they could never anticipate. By the time I returned to the office again, weeks later, the silence had transformed from oppression into empowerment. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow, every memory was no longer just a reminder of loss. It was a teacher. I had learned patience. I had learned observation. I had learned the value of withholding reaction, of allowing others to underestimate me. The contractor's mocking words, the laughter of strangers, the public derision, all of it had become fuel, quietly stored for a reckoning that would come. Silence had made me stronger, but it had also made me dangerous in ways I had not yet realized. In the absence of distraction, I could see the patterns of human behavior, the arrogance of those who prey on weakness, and the moments when their pride would blind them to their own vulnerability. It was a lesson I would carry into the next phase, a quiet preparation for a power shift that would one day leave them shocked, bewildered, and unable to ignore the consequences of their cruelty. The weeks of silence had changed me more than I could have anticipated. What had begun as pain and public humiliation had transformed into a quiet, simmering awareness. I had learned to move through the office, through my home, even through the world outside, with the calm precision of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to reclaim. I was no longer the man who flinched at the contractor's words. I was a man preparing, observing, waiting for the moment when the balance would tilt. I started small. I documented everything. Every interaction, every careless remark, every subtle insult was logged in meticulous detail. The contractor's arrogance, once terrifying, became predictable. His need to display dominance, to mock those he assumed were weaker, had a rhythm. Every joke, every gesture, every glance carried a pattern I could anticipate. In the silence that had once crushed me, I now found clarity. I understood his world, and more importantly, I understood where he was vulnerable. I also began to reclaim the office, but not in the way he expected. While he assumed I would cower, I started making subtle changes, rearranging files, ensuring that every repair he had done could be reversed or adjusted. I watched him as he worked, noting the flaws in his methods, the shortcuts, the mistakes hidden in plain sight. He had believed that confidence and mockery were enough to dominate, but in reality, they left him exposed to someone patient and observant. I was becoming that someone. The power shift didn't happen overnight. It started with small victories that gave me confidence. I would arrive earlier than him, quietly moving tools or adjusting minor details so that when he returned, his sense of control would falter, just slightly, just enough for him to notice the cracks in his own authority. He began to hesitate, to question, though he never suspected the source. Every pause, every moment of uncertainty was a victory I savored silently. My anger had been transformed into strategy, my humiliation into leverage. And then came the confrontation that marked the turning point. The contractor arrived as usual with his usual swagger, but I was ready. I had positioned documents, adjusted his workstations, and ensured that his mistakes would be visible to anyone who entered. When he noticed, the arrogance faltered. His smile wavered, his voice lost its certainty. He was no longer the predator. He was the man on the defensive, the one forced to explain, justify, and defend himself. The power had shifted without a word being spoken. I didn't gloat. I didn't mock. I simply observed, letting the discomfort grow, letting him feel the same helplessness he had once imposed on me. I had learned that real power isn't loud. It isn't cruel. It is quiet, deliberate, and undeniable. The humiliation I had endured had taught me this lesson. The world respects strength that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind of strength that forces others to reckon with their own arrogance. By controlling the environment, by understanding the contractor's methods, and by patiently allowing him to make mistakes, I had turned the tables. He began to consult me, asking questions he had never needed to ask before. His companions no longer laughed at my expense. They were cautious, wary, unsure how to navigate the subtle shift they could sense but not yet comprehend. The contractor had lost his edge, not because I had attacked him, but because I had quietly claimed it, step by step, methodically, without alerting him to my intent until it was already inevitable. Even outside the office, the shift was evident. Colleagues who had once assumed I was weak or incapable began to treat me differently. My calm, composed presence drew respect, not because I demanded it, but because I had reclaimed it through observation, strategy, and restraint. The humiliation that had once defined me was now a memory, a lesson, a reminder that those who underestimate patience and calculation will eventually be caught off guard. I remember the moment I realized the full extent of the shift. The contractor, normally so brash, approached me with caution, measuring his words, his gestures, the tone of his voice. The arrogance that had cut me to the bone weeks ago was gone, replaced by a subtle tension, a recognition that I had regained control of my space, my dignity, and my life. The power was no longer his. It had quietly, inevitably become mine. And in that realization, I felt a strange satisfaction, not revenge yet, not even satisfaction in the traditional sense, but a deep, abiding sense of justice. The balance had been restored, and it had been done not through confrontation, but through patience, silence, and strategy. The lessons of pain, humiliation, and quiet observation had culminated in this moment, a testament to the resilience that grief can forge when paired with clarity of mind. I continued to work this way, subtly, strategically, until the contractor's influence waned completely. He no longer spoke over me, no longer assumed dominance. His every move was measured, cautious, and it was clear that he recognized, consciously or not, that the landscape had changed. What he had once viewed as weakness, my solitude, my grief, my silence, was now my strength. I had turned every disadvantage into an advantage, every insult into fuel, every moment of public humiliation into preparation for this quiet reclamation of power. And yet the true shift wasn't in him alone. The real change was in me. I had learned to channel my pain, to endure humiliation, to embrace silence, and to transform them into something formidable. I was no longer the man who entered the office trembling with shame. I was a man who had faced the world's cruelty, who had been mocked, exposed, and humiliated, and had emerged not broken but stronger. The power was no longer something I sought. It was a state of being, a presence, a force that could not be ignored. This quiet reclamation of power set the stage for what was to come. The contractor's arrogance had been dismantled, and the humiliation he had imposed on me had been reversed, not through anger, not through confrontation, but through patience, observation, and calculated action. The world that had once mocked me was now aware, subtly, of my presence, my strength, and the consequences of underestimating me. The shift was complete, but the story was far from over. There was still one final element remaining. The reckoning, the moment when the shock of what had been quietly prepared would confront the arrogance of those who had assumed they were untouchable. And so the stage was set. The power had shifted. I had reclaimed control, and every move I made from this point forward would be deliberate, purposeful, and unassailable. The contractor, the men who laughed at my expense, the world that had witnessed my pain, They would all soon discover that the quietest forces often carry the heaviest consequences. The day of reckoning arrived quietly, almost unnoticeably, but the impact would be unforgettable. I had waited, observed, and planned for weeks, letting every insult, every mocking word, every shred of humiliation fuel a carefully constructed strategy. The contractor and his companions had grown complacent, confident in their perceived dominance. They believed the power shift had merely been a minor inconvenience, a subtle correction, not realizing that I had been preparing something far more decisive. I began by inviting them to the office under the guise of a routine review of the repairs. Their smiles were smug, their laughter casual, as if they were stepping into familiar territory. I greeted them politely, quietly, with no sign of the tension that had built inside me over the past weeks. Their arrogance was palpable. They had forgotten the man they had mocked, the solitary figure who had endured public humiliation and emerged unbroken. I let them believe they were still in control, watching their confidence swell with each step they took into my carefully arranged trap. The first move was subtle. I had ensured that every tool, every document, every minor repair they had rushed through was now positioned to reveal their carelessness. As they walked the room, I watched their expressions change, tiny cracks appearing in the facade of superiority. A loose wire here, a crooked shelf there, things they would have dismissed, things that now reflected directly on their competence. They whispered among themselves, uncertainty creeping into their voices for the first time. The contractor's smirk faltered. He glanced at me, searching for reassurance but found only calm, quiet observation. Then came the moment that truly shocked them. I revealed the detailed log I had kept of every insult, every mocking remark, every violation of my wife's memory. The words they had spoken, the laughter they had shared, were no longer intangible. They were documented, undeniable. I presented it matter-of-factly, letting the weight of evidence speak for itself. The contractor's face drained of color as he realized the meticulous record I had maintained. His companions looked at me, astonished, unsure how to respond to a man they had assumed was powerless. The power of shock was not just in exposure, it was in control. I guided them through each instance, each insult, each public humiliation, showing them exactly how their arrogance had been observed, recorded, and transformed into leverage. They could not interrupt, could not argue, could not laugh. Their mockery had been weaponized against them, and the realization struck like a physical blow. They had believed dominance came from intimidation and loud confidence, but they had underestimated the quiet, patient force of someone who had endured, observed, and learned. I did not shout, I did not demand apologies. I simply let them absorb the evidence, the undeniable truth of their arrogance and cruelty. The contractor's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger mixed with fear crossing his features. He realized too late that the man he had mocked, humiliated, and underestimated was now fully in command of the situation. Every sneer he had delivered, every careless remark he had made, had been catalogued and repurposed, turning his own power against him. Then, with calculated precision, I revealed the final layer of my preparation, the modifications I had made to the office itself. Subtle, seemingly minor adjustments, designed to highlight their mistakes, their shortcuts, and their incompetence. Every crooked shelf, every poorly executed repair, every misaligned piece of furniture was laid bare. The contractor and his companions could see, in an instant, how the space had been manipulated to expose their failings. Shock rippled through the room, their arrogance replaced by unease, their confidence replaced by the stark realization that they were no longer in control. The silence that followed was profound. The same silence that had once crushed me, that had forced me to confront my grief and humiliation, now served as a tool of power. They could not speak, could not respond, could not reclaim the narrative. The shock of what had been quietly prepared, what had been patiently executed, left them disoriented, humbled, and unable to assert authority. They had walked into a trap of observation, strategy, and silent preparation, and now they were paying the price of underestimating me. I allowed the moment to linger. I did not gloat, I did not mock. The satisfaction was in the quiet, the undeniable reversal of roles. They had once believed they could dominate me, humiliate me, strip me of dignity. Now they were powerless witnesses to the consequences of their arrogance. Shock, I realized, is more effective than anger. It is precise, surgical, and leaves an imprint that lingers far longer than words or violence ever could. As the contractor struggled to maintain composure, I addressed him directly, my voice calm but firm. The assumptions you made about me, about my family, about my ability to endure, those were your mistakes. You assumed weakness where there was strength, emptiness where there was preparation, and in that you were wrong. His eyes widened, the realization sinking in that the man he had mocked was not only unbroken but had orchestrated a reversal that left him exposed, vulnerable, and without recourse. His companions avoided my gaze, silently acknowledging the shift, the undeniable proof that they had misjudged me. I watched as the shock settled over them, not as an act of vengeance in the moment, but as a precise lesson, one they would carry long after leaving the office. The contractor had once ruled this space with arrogance and mockery. Now he navigated it cautiously, aware of his own vulnerability. The balance of power, once skewed against me, had been decisively corrected. And in that quiet, controlled moment, I felt a deep sense of vindication. Not revenge for revenge's sake, but the satisfaction of equilibrium restored. The humiliation I had endured, the pain I had survived, the silence I had mastered, all converged into a single, decisive shift. The shock of their exposure was complete, absolute, and irrevocable. By the time they left the office, the contractor and his companions were no longer figures of intimidation. They were cautious, wary, subdued, and fully aware that the man they had underestimated had quietly, methodically, reclaimed control. The shock had been delivered without violence, without spectacle, yet it resonated more powerfully than any confrontation could have. In the aftermath, I understood that shock is a force of nature when applied with patience, observation, and strategy. The humiliation they had inflicted on me had been reversed in a way that left them speechless, leaving no room for arrogance or assumption. They had learned in the most undeniable way that underestimating a man who endures pain, observes silently, and plans with precision is a mistake that carries consequences. That day the balance of power had fully shifted. The contractor's reign of mockery, his casual arrogance, his assumption of my helplessness, all had been dismantled quietly without fanfare but with undeniable effect. Shock, as I had discovered, is a weapon far more potent than anger, far more precise than retaliation. It leaves a mark, not just on those who witness it but on the narrative of control itself. And as I watched them leave, humbled and wary, I knew that the final stage was near, the stage where justice would be moral, undeniable, and complete. Shock had done its work, but now the world would witness the consequences of cruelty and arrogance in the most profound, inescapable way. The contractor never forgot that day. Not the evidence, not the exposure, not the subtle dismantling of his arrogance. But moral justice is rarely about fear or intimidation. It is about consequences that are inevitable, inescapable, and undeniable. I had already shown him the power shift and delivered the shock, but there was one final layer he needed to experience. The quiet reckoning that comes from knowing wrongdoing carries its due weight. I made it known, carefully and deliberately, that I would oversee the remainder of the office project personally. Every decision, every adjustment, every repair passed through my hands. His shortcuts, his careless work, were no longer just visible. They were corrected, documented, and preserved as evidence of accountability. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about demonstrating that actions have consequences, and that arrogance, mockery, and cruelty toward another person's dignity inevitably invite correction. The contractor and his companions realized slowly that they were no longer in charge. Their power had been stripped from them, and now they were accountable not just to me, but to the integrity of the work they had taken lightly. I watched as their once bold postures faltered. Orders they had previously given were now questioned. Instructions they had assumed would be ignored were now meticulously observed. They had learned, in the simplest but most profound way, that mockery and derision carry costs that cannot be avoided when faced with patience, strategy, and moral resolve. I did not need to speak loudly or to publicly humiliate them further. Moral justice is quiet. It exists in the natural consequences of actions. The crooked shelves, the poorly executed repairs, the casual arrogance that had once amused them, all of it now reflected back on them in undeniable clarity. Their credibility, their assumed dominance, even their pride had been quietly dismantled, and they could do nothing to restore it. I had reclaimed not just my dignity, but the moral authority of right and wrong, the undeniable truth that cruelty toward another person ultimately comes at a cost. What was most satisfying, however, was the transformation in the atmosphere of the office. Where there had once been mockery, there was now a sense of respect, not born of fear, but of recognition. The contractor treated me differently, yes, but more importantly, he understood that respect is earned, not assumed. My wife's legacy, the office, her achievements, her vision, was now preserved, honored, and protected. Her memory, which had been threatened by mockery and carelessness, now stood untarnished, an enduring testament to integrity, patience, and quiet strength. In the end, moral justice is not about spectacle. It is about restoring balance, ensuring accountability, and allowing truth to assert itself. The contractor, the men who laughed at me, and everyone who assumed my grief made me weak, they were all confronted with the consequences of their choices. The lesson was clear. Cruelty, mockery, and arrogance toward another human being are never without cost. And the cost, when meted out with quiet precision and unwavering patience, is often far greater than the offender anticipates. I sat in her office one final time alone, yet no longer broken. Pain had been endured, public humiliation had been survived, silence had been mastered, power had shifted, shock had been delivered, and now moral justice had been served. The arc was complete. My grief, my suffering, and my patience had been transformed into something undeniable: truth, integrity, and an unshakable claim to dignity. As I turned off the lights and left the office, I realized that moral justice is both simple and profound. It does not require vengeance or cruelty. It requires endurance, observation, and action guided by principle. And in that understanding, I felt a quiet peace. The contractor had been held accountable, my wife's memory protected, and I had reclaimed not just control of her office, but of my own life. The cycle was complete, and the lessons of pain, humiliation, silence, power, and shock had culminated in something far greater than revenge. They had culminated in justice.